Right.
Exactly. And that same approach of building those values in the culture
Hmm.
is what needs to happen in the home.
Yeah.
And that's what parents, where I said earlier, some parents don't talk about it at all.
Hmm.
They think it's shameful. And we need to get to a place where we recognize that God created us this way.
Hmm.
He didn't create the deviancy, that's just our sin.
Hmm.
But there's a reason why our bodies have changed, and it's perfectly normal. And so, when my son expressed like what's happening to my body, we're had a very close relationship, so he was not embarrassed to ask me. He was really scared because he didn't understand why his body was doing the things it was doing.
Yeah.
And the first thing I told him, to just because I could tell he was scared, was just to tell him, you're becoming a teenager, you're going through puberty. And I said, congratulations, your body's doing exactly what God created it to do at this time of your life.
Yeah.
And you're going to have more changes, and you're going to have more questions.
Hmm.
And I just want you to know that God created you this way. These things are happening because God has said it's time for your body to do this. And that's okay.
Hmm.
And now let's talk about ways, to manage these things, and have those conversations. And so that really calmed him down to realize this is normal, this is okay,
Hmm.
and there are things I can do. And then of course we had to have those conversations, and I was a single mom, so it was me doing that. But so I think that that's another thing, is that as parents, we may have been taught about our sexuality or about our bodies in such a way that we're afraid to talk about it. I know I met a woman much older than myself, but she admitted that when she got married, she was afraid of intimacy because her mom, they came from, it was a Christian family,
Hmm.
but her mom had this view of sexuality that was very negative, and everything that she taught her daughter was avoided, and it was horrible. It was bad, just, with like, don't touch the hot stove kind of thing. And so she said that when she got married, it took a long time for her to undo all of that and to recognize that intimacy in her marriage was a beautiful
Hmm.
thing. And so, we don't want to put a distorted view of sexual intimacy as God created it into our children, because it is something that God has given us that is very
Yeah.
beautiful.
What advice would you have for parents then who want to be able to talk to their kids about this? Like, how much should kids know? How do they talk about it? Obviously, it doesn't seem like learning about it in schools, and definitely not from Planned Parenthood's the answer. So, what are the alternatives?
Right. Well, I believe what God teaches us in Deuteronomy when he talks about that we are to teach our children God's truth,
Hmm.
as we wake up, as we lay down, as we walk by the way. Essentially, we are our children's primary educators on all things. And that includes how God created them, and how God created humanity, period. We can just go back to Genesis. And all of this was me asking the Lord after I left and became a Christian. And I was asking God, well, how do we do this? And so he took me to Genesis and reminded me, I created you. You were created in the image of God, male and female. Which back then was like, that's interesting that God says male and female. And now we're seeing today why he knew that it was going to be important for us to know that. When God talks about, so really when you look at Adam and Eve, what I began to learn was that the first, the family was the first church and the first government. And we are still the first church and the first government for our children. And so, we are the primary and sole authority over our children, parents are. And we are the teachers of that child, so we are the church because we're commanded to teach our children about the Lord and his truths. And so, I don't believe that it should actually be youth pastors or other people, even within the church, teaching your child about something so intimate. That is something that God has asked the parents to teach.
Mhm.
Now, I do believe that the church can provide resources and support in many ways, but they are not the sole authority over our children. They are not the primary educators of our children. The parents are. And so, my advice to parents is to, if you don't already have a healthy view of sexuality, sexual intimacy, if you don't already know God's purpose for all of that, then dive into that first. Start to really align yourself with God's truth about that. So just because we're Christian doesn't mean that we actually have that worldview about sexual intimacy and
Mhm.
marriage. For parents who are single parents, thinking, well, how can I talk about these things when, you know, I'm a single parent, there's so many different ways that someone becomes a single parent. I myself was not married when I had my son. And so I had those same questions, like, how do I talk to my son about what's right when I did it all wrong?
Mhm.
But the truth is that I know what's right now.
Mhm.
I learned what was right when I became a Christian. And so a good parent teaches their child what is true and what is right, not what they did in their past necessarily. And so it was very obvious that, and I even told my son, it's obvious that I'm a single parent. You don't have your dad with you. And it hurts. And the reason it hurts is because that's not how God designed it. This is how God designed it. And this is what we should be striving for. And so he understood that. So he understood that maybe I didn't make the right decisions, but now that I knew what was right, I was teaching him what was right. And then he gets to choose that for himself. And so that's another thing about parenting is that we teach our children the truth,
Mhm.
and then they are completely independent of us in many ways, obviously. And so we need to just show our children grace, mercy, and forgiveness when they fall, when they sin, just as God teaches, just as God forgives us and gives us grace and mercy when we repent. And so, teaching our children the truth in the right way, and setting up boundaries to help them make good decisions is all part of parenting.
Mhm.
It's also a reality that you might discover that your child has seen pornography. You have to address it when it happens. You might find out that your child did become sexually active. You have to have a plan together, husband and wife, or as a single parent, to decide how am I going to respond if that happens,
Mhm.
and what new boundaries do I need to set to ensure it doesn't repeat. Um, as a family, you need to discuss what will we do if our child conceives a child,
Yeah.
because we don't want to go to abortion. There's so many Christian families have actually gone to abortion because they didn't think about it ahead of time. And so these are things that I tell parents, like, we teach our children what is right and what is true, but it doesn't guarantee that they're not going to sin.
Mhm.
So prepare yourself on how you're going to respond if they do sin. um, but a lot of it is just being open, and not only about God's truth and teaching them, what God has, how God is, his purpose for humanity and marriage and family and children, but also it's important for parents to understand what's happening in the culture. We see that Paul in the New Testament understood the culture. He didn't enable the culture, he didn't adopt the ways of the culture, but he knew enough about the secular world to make a connection with people so that he could teach them the gospel and the way to the Father. And so that is something that parents need to do as well. You need to know the research behind homosexuality, the transgender movement. What are STDs? We need to be educated on those topics so that when our children will challenge us on those topics, or when the topic arises, whether it's because we watch the news or someone had brought it up at church or whatever happens, that parents are able to show their children that they are the authority, and that you do know what is happening in the culture, and that you can guide them towards optimal behavior.
Mhm.
And so that's really important. There's no fear in teaching children about STDs.
Mhm.
For me, I taught my son the right way to behave. That this is reserved for marriage. Of course, it's just a little quick summary. I taught him the right way, but I also said, now in the world there are people who choose to have sex outside of marriage, and this is what they have to face.
Mhm.
And so that was my way of being able to teach STDs without making it sound like I was giving him permission to do
Mhm.
it. So it's not, hey, when you decide to have sex outside of marriage, this is what you're going to face. No, it was, some people choose to have sex outside of marriage.
Mhm.
and these are the consequences of
The
that.
physical
And
dangers
that
as
was
well as the
scary to
spiritual
him.
ones, that there's actual physical complications.
That's right. That's right. There's physical, there's spiritual, and there's emotional consequences to choosing sex outside of marriage, as well as what are the consequences, which are good consequences, if you choose to do this only in marriage.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it does mean that we get educated.
Yeah.
It means that we have to educate ourselves so that we can be that authority for our children,
Mhm.
because I have received reports from families who their children are very condescending towards them because they have learned the language of "you're old-fashioned, it's because 'cause you're a Christian, and you don't understand the homosexual community."
Mhm.
But if you actually do the research yourself and pray about it, you will have a response that will again reestablish you as the authority of your child.
Mhm.
And remember that just because a child rebels doesn't mean you're not the authority.
Yeah.
You're still the authority. And that's important for parents to know, that there is no privacy with children. There's some common privacy, like they're going to change their clothes. Of course, they're going to close the door. I mean, small things like that. But as the authority of a child over a child, you're the protector. You need to know what's happening in that child's life.